Thank you very much, Mr. Young. Very good afternoon to you, members of the media, members of the listening and viewing public. I'm pleased to have returned, and I take this opportunity to bring you up to date on a mission which I participated in as authorized by the CARICOM Heads of Government Conference. To fully appreciate what we have been engaged in and what we are engaged in, it is useful for me to go back a little bit to last week, Thursday, when, notwithstanding what we have been experiencing in our neighborhood, last week, Thursday, developments with respect to the Venezuelan political situation, responding ostensibly to the Venezuelan socioeconomic situation, those two conditions combined triggered a response from the United States to the government of Venezuela. CARICOM was alarmed by the conditions that appeared on the horizon and called for a teleconference between the heads, because it was the only way for us to get together very quickly to analyze the situation and determine what it meant and what response the CARICOM should make. This announcement followed from a meeting in which a vote was taken sponsored by the Lima Group, which is a group of South American countries who were responding to the Venezuelan situation and felt that they could bring about an end to the Venezuelan situation by certain actions. The long and the short of that was that we saw the establishment in Venezuela of a parallel authority supported by the United States and some South American countries. The Venezuelan government responded to that by attempting to expel the US after they announced, and that's Venezuela, I mean, a breaking of relations with the United States. So very, very quickly, in a matter of hours, we moved from a situation where there was a Venezuelan government in office, there were people concerned all around about Venezuela's internal situation, to one where Venezuela and the United States had broken off, well, Venezuela broke off relations with the United States, asking them to withdraw their embassy personnel, and the US saying that if that comes to pass, there will be consequences. And of course, very quickly, in a matter of hours, there was this recognition of a president in Venezuela from the National Assembly election results, and a declaration that the sitting president of Venezuela was illegitimate. Now, at the same time this was happening, questions were being put outside of the region as to how this is going to work. And the US response was that all options are on the table. CARICOM realized that what had happened here is that even though we are closest to Venezuela and in the firing line of these developments, which are not of our making, any follow-through on these threats from either end could create a situation that could have serious consequences for us here in the Caribbean, particularly Trinidad and Tobago, we being so close and already involved in receiving Venezuelan economic migrants or refugees, if you want to call them that. We were very concerned that this kind of escalation of tensions and the volatile situation, which could come to a head with these two countries engaging in physical disturbances, we had consequences to suffer. So we had a meeting at the Hyatt, lasted from 4:30 until 10 o'clock. And most CARICOM territories' heads took part in that meeting, either the head of government or an authorized minister or a public servant who was there. So we had a very good participation. And even though a few CARICOM members had voted with the Lima Group for some kind of intervention in Venezuela, the reality of this volatile situation, which could play out in military intervention, expulsion of diplomats, reasons for intervention, and so on. At the end of the thoroughly reviewed position, CARICOM heads took a position, and the position was this: we are not going to deviate from our position taken at an earlier time, and the long-standing position that the issue of Venezuela with respect to a solution is a matter for the Venezuelan people. And that covered our position of non-interference in the affairs, not of Venezuela, but the non-interference in the affairs of state, non-intervention into states, and the OAS Charter, which specifically spells out the uncompromising position of the inviolability of territorial integrity, meaning that under no circumstances should one territory violate the territorial integrity of another. Against that background, that this is the CARICOM's position, CARICOM then understood that these drums of war that were rattling from Venezuela to Washington were being pounded by persons who either had not taken us into account or disregard our interests and the consequences of such actions on the CARICOM. Barbados was extremely strong in pointing out that once we get into a situation where the Southern Caribbean becomes an area of conflict between our neighbors and partners of this way, it would do nothing but harm to the economy of the region, because tourists really don't leave home to go to war zones for vacation. And the brittle nature of CARICOM territories are such that any conflict that is sparked in this region could have long-term deleterious consequences for the Caribbean. That being so, we decided on Thursday night that we need to get out of the Caribbean, get to the United Nations, so that the rest of the world could understand what we were facing, not of our doing, but the threat to the Caribbean as a whole. And of course, prior to this, we lived in an area of the world, Caribbean Sea, which we have designated and which we defend as a zone of peace. Against those principles, we saw the volatility of the recent developments as threatening all of that. So, the chairman of the CARICOM at this time, in preparation for the meeting next month, which was already in place, is Dr. Harris, who is the Prime Minister of St. Kitts Nevis, and the delegation comprised Dr. Harris as chairman, myself, Prime Minister of Barbados, the ambassador from Grenada, and all the UN representatives in New York. And we do have, as a zone, a very strong representation there. You have Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Antigua, Grenada, Barbados, and Lucia, and they all participated in preparing. So by Monday morning, we caucused in New York, the delegation, and we approached the Secretary General, who very graciously agreed to see us at the appointed time. We saw this Secretary General of the United Nations at 10 o'clock. We outlined to him our observation of the Security Council meeting that took place a few hours before, which indicated the position of persons, either those who were complaining about the Venezuelan situation requiring action, or those who were objecting to the action being proposed by those who were proposing action. So there was a very lively Security Council debate. But interestingly enough, the Secretary General pointed out to us, the CARICOM delegation, that we are to understand that the role of the Security Council is not about authenticating elections in any country. And that is important, because the justification for declaring Maduro as being illegitimate is that the decision made from some quarters is that the elections that were boycotted by the opposition deemed the Maduro election illegitimate. So against that background, the Secretary General said that that is not a matter that, as far as he's aware, that the Security Council is having before it to make an adjudication. Secondly, we pointed out the difficulty that we were in, that even some of you, our own media, are misrepresenting the situation, saying that because we have not taken a side in this matter, that we are supporting Maduro by not voting with the Lima group to take action in Venezuela. We are supporting Maduro. And the Secretary General said to us, well, we at the United Nations have a Venezuelan government seated here. And until a change is made that properly goes through the UN General Assembly position, and that country is changed and properly seated, I, as Secretary General, have to deal with the government that is seated at the UN, which is the Maduro government. So this should put an end to this attempt by others to push us into some camp, having abstained in a vote where we were being asked to take a side on who's not with me is my enemy. The options at that vote were to vote for, to vote against, or to abstain. Our abstention is rooted in our position of non-interference and non-intervention. I saw an article in today's papers a moment ago by one of your politicians, one of your columnists, asking, I presume, the government of Trinidad and Tobago or CARICOM to explain what non-interference and non-intervention mean. I thought that was clear. Non-interference means we are not joining any action for physical interference in Venezuela. Interference means we are not backing any horse in the Venezuelan political race. So what then did we want to achieve? First, we wanted to achieve a lowering of the tension. We wanted to have the volatility subside so that no accidental intervention could take place and we get mixed up in conflict by accident. We ask that this be the condition coming from the UN. You may ask, why did we go to the UN and not to the OAS? The reason being that long before this level of volatility had appeared, the OAS had disqualified itself from treating with the Venezuelan issue. How? Because the Secretary General of the OAS had taken on personally the presidency of Venezuela and had been advocating and, well, virtually an overthrow of the Venezuelan government. Trinidad and Tobago, as a country under the rule of law and a long-standing member of the OAS, and knowing the OAS Charter, had objected to that because we always knew that if the situation worsened, or even before it worsened, that the OAS was our first port of call to have this matter dealt with through dialogue and negotiation. By the Secretary General, without reference to us in the CARICOM, we don't know who else he was referred to, but without reference to us here in the CARICOM, taking on from his office an attack on a member government, that created a problem for the OAS. And now that this new parallel government was declared in Venezuela, once again, without reference to us here as members of the OAS, the Secretary General went ahead and recognized the new president. So those developments had the effect of deeming the OAS unsuitable to be an honest broker in a situation where we believe dialogue and negotiation is what is required to bring stability to the Venezuelan situation. So we met the Secretary General and we made ourselves available to meet with a number of missions where there are countries that are interested or involved in this new development on our doorstep. We met with the Uruguayans, we spoke at length with the Mexicans, we met with the South Africans, we met with the Russians, the Chinese, the OAU, the EU. So all of Tuesday, for the entire day of Tuesday, we met with missions, and on Monday. Much of it, persons who wanted to meet with CARICOM, because we did not set a list of finite persons we'd meet with. And finally, at the end of this, we met with the United States ambassador to the United Nations, and we had a very healthy conversation outlining the CARICOM position. That was a bilateral meeting, actually. It was Trinidad and Tobago that met with the ambassador. All the other meetings were CARICOM meetings. And we had a very good meeting with the United States ambassador outlining Trinidad and Tobago's position on its own and in CARICOM, one and the same. And we discovered a number of things. We discovered that outside of our bailiwick here, most people who were making these decisions had very little idea of even the geography of what is involved, far less the politics and the political history. And many of them were very grateful that we had come to inform them of the situation so that they could guide themselves away from the pitfalls that will only occur after the die has been cast. There was one interesting person I met, a very high-ranking official, who had absolutely no idea where Trinidad and Tobago was. And in the opening of our conversation, he asked me if we do have a golf course. There were other people who had no idea how close Trinidad and Tobago was to Venezuela and the physical and familial contacts that exist between us. Many had no idea that we were undergoing a crime wave, largely fueled by small arms flowing to us from South America, or that Colombian drugs could get to Port of Spain. Totally unaware of these conditions. What we did observe, that as we outlined our circumstances and the potential for South American harm to come to us by way of arms, ammunition, through instability, human trafficking, and our inability to handle any floods of refugees, we got and we saw sympathy. And we heard from a number of countries, even those who initially were minded to be identified with some undefined initiative with respect to rectification, that they will not increase the tension and they will not encourage and participate violent overthrow of a government in the hemisphere. But the root of all of this that disturbed us at CARICOM, and we spent a lot of time talking to the various countries about this. It is this sudden position where we all are at one in not accepting that the Venezuelan condition is acceptable or that it should persevere. Something requires to be done to improve the plight of the Venezuelan people. Whether the positive factors are as a result of internal political insufficiencies or external pressures and agendas, that's not the point. The point is that the Venezuelan situation, as a permanent situation, is unacceptable to all of us. However, to get up one morning and somebody says, the time for talk is over, that is where the danger lies. Because if one looks around the world, there are a lot of areas all over the world where there are difficulties of one kind or another, largely political. But in many of those situations, closing the door to dialogue is not an option and never has been an option. Some of those situations are permanent for decades. And of course, to say that we've tried before and it was attended by failure, so the time for talk is over. Now, the CARICOM's position is that once we take that position, once we support that position, that the time for talk is over, the corollary of that is that the time for physical intervention is here. And that runs counter to the fundamental principles that we started out with. And we pointed out that that decision, that the time for talk is over, is a decision that prevents us, in the presence of the United Nations, from utilizing what we believe is an avenue to treat with the Venezuelan problem. CARICOM advanced its position that the Secretary General should use his good office to provide the vehicle to bring the Venezuelan parties together under proper guidance and encouragement to thrash out their political problem which has Venezuela in this condition. The Secretary General pointed out that he's willing to do that, but such a good office would only be initiated when the Venezuelans indicate themselves that they are willing to participate in such good office. Understood, and that's what we expected. In the meantime, things are happening all around us. We have heard, we've seen on the news where the Venezuelan president has indicated, a long way from where they were, that the 72-hour deadline, because we also were critical of this use of ultimatum. Because once ultimatums are being issued, the potential for accidents exists in a very real sense. So we condemn the use of ultimatum, and we encourage the creation of a vehicle to allow those who want peace and security in the region to find themselves to the table and have that dialogue and negotiate that peace that could be lasting and sustainable. One of the more interesting meetings we had was with the government of Uruguay. You may recall, Uruguay, South American country, did not participate in the Lima group. So way back then, Uruguay kept itself away from the formation of the Lima group, anticipating that such a group and its formation was not helpful because it might result in what it has resulted in. Uruguay and Mexico, when the vote came, Uruguay and Mexico, South American, Central American countries, took the identical stance that was taken by Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua, Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Suriname. We all did not take a side in the Venezuelan issue. We did not vote for, and we did not vote against. We stood our ground in the middle on a neutrality. And the reason why CARICOM took that position, those of us who did it, was that we anticipated that the time will come where the CARICOM will have to play a major role in defense of our interests, but offering an opportunity of that neutrality to those in Venezuela and elsewhere who need a neutral point of view and a neutral stance as an honest broker in seeking to treat with the real issue, which is the condition of the Venezuelan people. The end result is that we are going to continue in this position. Mexico, Uruguay, and CARICOM, with the connections to the UN where that connection can be made, to reach out to the Venezuelans, to take advantage of this situation, to treat with their internal problems. It is not for us to intervene in Venezuela to fix the Venezuelan problem, but it is for us to assist them. And this is the kind of assistance that we could give. We are satisfied that this mission has been very successful in that it has brought a number of persons down from a heady position of intervention in Venezuela to one of reflection and review. We anticipate and we expect and we hope that there'll be a lessening of tensions, and that the more we look at the situation, the more level heads will come out and say there must be another way. And this whole question of the time for talk is over will recede, and the time for dialogue will replace it, and that dialogue, seeing movement from the Venezuelans, would bring us to a place with a better hope, better future. Because at the end of the day, whoever ends up running the Venezuelan affairs, that is a matter for the Venezuelan people. Again, in the fundamental doctrines of the UN, the determination of the people by themselves, for themselves. And that is the whole gist of it, and if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Dr. Rowley, you would have seen over the last 24 hours or so that Nicolas Maduro did say that he reached out to certain countries that have offered. Sorry. I'll start over, sorry. Kijan Haynes, TV6. Dr. Rowley, we've seen in the last 24 hours that Mr. Maduro did say that he's reached out to the heads of some countries who offered their countries as a place of mediation for talks. He mentioned Trinidad and Tobago specifically. Did Mr. Maduro reach out to you, and where do we stand on that?
He didn't reach out to us, but CARICOM, again, if you go back and look at the record, the first communique CARICOM issued, I think, was in 2017, November, or somewhere about that time. When CARICOM responded to the Venezuelan situation, the one thing we did was to offer our region as an area of neutrality where the warring parties in Venezuela could come and find an environment for pursuing dialogue on the internal problem. So if today he's saying that Trinidad and Tobago or any CARICOM country is a place, it goes back to that offer. And I've heard the Uruguayans also have made themselves available in a similar manner.
So he's still saying that the offer is available if you want
to. Oh, yes, that is CARICOM's position, maintaining one voice on this matter and maintaining CARICOM as an area of neutrality and an honest broker in this whole matter. The CARICOM region, whether it is Barbados, Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, we are available, and if they wish, we will be very happy to host and entertain them in a search for peace.
I ask that because if you look at some of the comments after this story broke, the people of Trinidad and Tobago are not as accepting as you are. What would you say to them that they change their mind?
I don't know that this is something that the people of Trinidad and Tobago should have a negative view on. If there are international issues, I just told you, there's a volatility which could see conflict, physical conflict on our doorstep, with all the attendant consequences of that. If those persons want a place to talk, and our country is selected as that place, and I will hold out to our citizens that that is what we do.
The Dragon gas deal in Parliament was said that we're looking for more information. Anything that you can add to that?
I don't understand the question.
There was a question raised in Parliament about where we stand with the Dragon gas deal, given the volatility in the country. I believe that it was the PDVSA sanctions specifically.
Well,
where have you looked into that more?
Well, that is a whole part of that is all wrapped up in what I was saying. In taking the position that the time for talk is over and the time for action is now, one of those actions is the PDVSA sanction. Everybody knows that even more so than Trinidad and Tobago, the Venezuelan economy is driven by the oil economy. So any attempt to deny the government in office access to the earnings of the oil economy of Venezuela is a strangulation which would have some kind of effect. I have been trying to find out what kind of effect that would have on the people of Venezuela who already were having difficulty obtaining certain things. So it has the potential to maybe not improve, and maybe the intention is that by that strangulation that it will bring about a response that will bring about a change of government. Again, that is not for us. That's not our doing. We have no part of that, except that we hope that it doesn't do that, because if it does worsen the Venezuelan situation, we here in Trinidad and Tobago will feel the fallout of that in some form or fashion. So those advocacies are not ours.
Mr. Prime Minister, good afternoon and welcome back. Urvashi from CNN. PNC3. I was kind of curious about your discussions with the Russian diplomats. What did that entail, given that the Russians have indicated their support?
Russia is a member of the Security Council. So we met, and so is China. And they took part in the Security Council meeting on this matter. And they expressed themselves, and they are opposed to it. We spoke to them as members of the Security Council of the UN. And incidentally, they carry a veto at the Security Council, Russia and China. And not to mention that one of the unease that our people here in Trinidad and Tobago was responding to was this whole question of Russian nuclear bombers in Venezuela. What does this mean? Why is this happening? Who is behind this? What is the intention? What will be the final outcome? This is what the threat, the trauma of a coming storm does, even though nothing might happen. Just living with those questions changes the game. So it was, I should tell you, we were informed by the Russians that they have no assets or personnel in Venezuela towards the furtherance of any military action.
Prime Minister,
I tell you that for what it's worth.
sorry to interrupt you, but as you mentioned, possible nuclear weapons and possible nuclear warfare, what about the possibility of it entering our airspace or our maritime,
What?
CARICOM as a whole?
What?
Nuclear weapons.
I can't speak to that. I don't know where the nuclear weapons are. Nuclear weapons are all over the world. They're in submarines, they're on ships, they're in planes. I was referring to the specific report that the Russian equipment had come to Venezuela, and I think they had left, or they're still there. I don't know. But I simply say, you asked me why we spoke to the Russians, and I gave you two reasons. One is that they are a member of the UN Security Council with a veto. And two, their name was called in Venezuela as passing through or taking to Venezuela very sophisticated weapons. And we in the CARICOM, we see our zone of peace as not a place for the parading of brinkmanship.
Taking it a bit further from the zone of peace, will we be exploring the option of making our zones nuclear free?
Well, I don't know. We have a position on that, but we can't enforce it. We are not sufficiently military strong to enforce that. I mean, even between Trinidad and Tobago, where you have ocean-going vessels of all kinds, we don't know what submarines pass through there. We don't know who is off our coast right now with what. Right? So most we can do is stand on principle. Our position in these matters as a small island state, unlike our neighbors, we, more than others, have to stand on principle. It is the principle that will defend us, because we cannot physically enforce our positions or defend ourselves. So that is why we are so wedded to the UN principle of non-interference, wedded to the UN principle of non-intervention, because without that principle, there's other considerations.
So you also mentioned that you met with U.S. diplomats. Now, shortly before your departure, the U.S. Embassy here would have issued a statement. Did that at all come up for discussions, and what was their position? What was the position?
What we met at the United Nations, every country is represented there by an ambassador. We have our ambassador, Her Excellency Penny Beckles, as a Grenadian ambassador. And at that mission, there's a UN ambassador, a US ambassador. So we met with as many people as we could have, not the least. By the time we met the United States ambassador, we had met with so many other people that we had a very good perspective on what was going on and where our stance was. And that allowed us to talk a little more informatively with the United States through its ambassador at New York.
If I remember correctly, the U.S. Embassy expressed their, I don't know if it's disapproval with our recognition, whether or not we recognize Mr. Maduro, our position. Were you able to make our position a bit more clear?
Yeah, we made it a lot clearer, and we just have to stand by our principles. And the comment from Marley Street, we responded to that already, and we continue to maintain our friendly and working relationship with the United States. The ambassador at the United Nations is a United States envoy, and we speak as we would speak anywhere else.
Question: as this crisis in Venezuela continues to unfold, we're seeing many reports of many more Trinidadians being abducted at sea and being held, ransoms have been demanded. Our position on that? Are we negotiating via Foreign Affairs to get these persons returned?
Well, I don't know the details of what happened in the particular instance at sea with our nationals on the Venezuelan territory. What I do know is that if you do not have proper law and order on the borders enforced by governments that are in control, those kinds of developments can become more the norm than the infrequent.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Karen Kose Philip, TDT News. I can't recall if you mentioned anything about this, but seeing that we have relationship with Venezuela, has anyone in our government or reached out to Mr. Maduro to find out how his position?
Yes, we have Trinidad. Let's make this very clear, because I know some of you in the media may not have spent the time to work on the background with this. Trinidad and Tobago has diplomatic relations with Venezuela. I know it makes good reading to talk about Maduro. Our connection as a country to the country across the Gulf from us is Venezuela. We have done nothing to break those ties. So the normal contact between countries, Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, continue. However, the CARICOM, where Trinidad and Tobago is playing a leading role, our position is subsumed in the CARICOM position. And the CARICOM, as a matter of fact, at the CARICOM meeting here in Trinidad, I was here in Trinidad, and we were around the region by conference. Amazing technology, where all of us could be in the same room in different countries, sort of. But at that time, we, as CARICOM, did reach out to the Venezuelan government asking for calm and restraint as a CARICOM position, and that involves Trinidad and Tobago. Calm and restraint, because what we wanted was a lessening of the tensions and an avoidance of accidents or deliberate action with which we may not have an agreement. And of course, while we were in New York, in dealing with the ambassadors who were there representing countries, incidentally, we were able, from our meeting in New York, when we were meeting with the Venezuelan ambassador, we were able to speak directly to President Maduro. The CARICOM delegation in New York spoke at length, listened to, and spoke to President Maduro from this mission. CARICOM, where Trinidad and Tobago is playing a leadership role.
So no one from government has, as you say, picked up the phone from Trinidad and called the presidential palace and spoke to
No, it doesn't go like that. We have different levels of contact. I know at least one, the Minister of National Security may talk to the Minister of Defense over there, or the Deputy President, Mr. Delcy Rodriguez. So we have always been in contact with Venezuela because we have business. Right now, I'm just told we have a few citizens somewhere in the river mouth down there who have been kidnapped. You have to talk to the government of Venezuela, because we now have to talk to the Venezuelan military about what is going on there in defense and protection of our citizens. So we have an ongoing working relationship with the government of Venezuela. Whatever difficulties they have inside as to who is government, the one that we, as I told you what the Secretary General said, the Secretary General told us, the Caribbean delegation, I, as Secretary General, I have to deal with the government in Venezuela which is seated by the General Assembly in there. And until such time as that change is properly made, I have to treat with Mr. Maduro. And those are the words of the Secretary General of the United Nations.
Okay, and it's reported that the interim president, Juan Guaido, has refused Trinidad and Tobago as a place of dialogue. So what is the next position?
I haven't heard that, but again, we are not going to be distracted by that. It matters not where it is done, and we're not going to make an issue of that. What we want is for them to accept that there needs to be dialogue, and that the position of time for talk is over and time for other action is now. That is what you want to hear about. We would be very happy at CARICOM, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, if what we hear from the Venezuelans is that we're moving away from this thing about time for talk is over, time for action, because that action has the potential to affect us.
News from Newsday. You mentioned with your meeting with the U.S. ambassador to the UN, you presented the CARICOM position, non-intervention, non-interference. I don't know if you could speak to what was the position presented by the U.S. ambassador or concerns raised at that meeting.
Well, I don't know that there's any secret position. I mean, these positions are very well known. The American position is on CNN, and even as we speak now, it's changing. So, but we didn't go into that kind of detail because those decisions being made at the top of the government, the ambassador would not be engaging those with us. We spent the time impressing upon the ambassador the concerns that we have for the repercussions of the abandonment of the non-intervention principle and the non-interference principle, and impressing upon him, for the benefit of his governments, by transmission through him, that we stand to be hurt by a decision of that nature, which may bring conflict to our doorstep, a conflict not of our making.
And you've been speaking about easing of tensions. What about with the U.S. Embassy in Trinidad? Have officials met, and has there been an easing of tension since that somewhat critical?
We are in contact with the United States at all levels. As a matter of fact, the Minister of National Security has been in touch with the local ambassador here. It's a problem that we're all trying to work through. What you have is a difference of opinion. And we maintain, without apology, that Trinidad and Tobago is entitled to have a difference of opinion with any country, on any matter, in the interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm a little disappointed that we could not, even in this sensitive situation, we could not count on our opposition. In England, the opposition is called the loyal opposition, Her Majesty's loyal opposition. We in Trinidad and Tobago could use no such adjective. Because notwithstanding the fact that you may have a different point of view, it would have been useful if our opposition could have seen the principle upon which the government of Trinidad and Tobago was standing in leadership at CARICOM, because that is the principle that protects small states more than any other. We cannot be convenient with principle. And therefore, we here in Trinidad and Tobago are a little embarrassed that the only place where we can't count on the rest of our parliament to stand with the government. Look, I have not heard a word from Barbados or Grenada or St. Kitts or Jamaica where anybody is trying to give the impression that their government is at war with the United States. Or because what is being said here in Trinidad and Tobago by a small number of voices is that we have somehow broken with the United States and we are going to lose our visas and we're going to lose our meal tickets. Come on, people. We are Trinidad and Tobago with a long, proud history of how we conduct ourselves. And one of the things that we got commended for as we went through the United Nations in the last 2 days is Trinidad and Tobago's record of good conduct in international affairs. And we're not going to blemish that now. And that is why we are in a position now to provide the leadership on this issue, small as we are. CARICOM for the first time is taking this leadership role with one voice, and I think the Caribbean people should be proud. With one voice, we are out there speaking as the CARICOM on a matter of great interest to us and of great import, because if this gets out of hand and we become just another zone of conflict, what little chance we had of progress would have gone through the window. So we have to stand up for ourselves. And unfortunately, not all of us see it that way.
From you, Mr. Prime Minister, you spoke earlier about the country's possible inability to deal with a flood of refugees. Just yesterday, the British High Commissioner expressed concern that Trinidad needs to have a process in place with the refugees currently in the country, possibly more coming in. There's been concerns from the opposition saying, where's the urgency to put that process? What is your response to that?
Well, if you had listened to me before I went away, you would have heard me saying that I had a meeting with the Archbishop, whose church is deeply involved in providing humanitarian support to our Venezuelan neighbors who are here and others. We have chosen as government to not go along the route of creating refugee camps, because refugee camps have their own kind of problem. We allowed a certain amount of integration initially of Venezuelans coming and going, and that continues in our relationship between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago. However, I also said then that we have agreed, and the Minister of National Security is working on it now, we have agreed to do a registration exercise which will allow us to give the Venezuelans who are here some kind of identification card, which will allow us to know who they are, know their comings and goings, and of course, to protect them as far as we are able to from exploitation. And alongside of that, we talk about the whole question of allowing them to work and their children go to school. And that's where we're heading. And the Minister of National Security is actively engaged in bringing that position to the cabinet.
Just to follow up, given Guaido's rising popularity and more acceptance in certain parts of the developed world, so to speak, is CARICOM willing to take that same unity and go to Guaido and have a conversation with him, even if it is to say, you know, we don't accept you or whatever? Is the CARICOM willing to speak to Guaido?
The answer is yes. We have said that all parties in Venezuela need to stand down and step back from where they are and talk their political problem out and negotiate their way out of it. As a matter of fact, during our meeting we were not a player in the recent development. So Mr. Guaido appeared virtually from nowhere. So we couldn't have had a contact with him. However, since he is now an alternative president, and from all responses in some quarters, an alternative government, our call for all persons in Venezuela to come together and talk this out and negotiate it out applies to Mr. Guaido as it applies to Mr. Maduro and his government. It is a Venezuelan problem. Short-circuiting it by hiring out the solution. The history of the world and the state of the world now is replete with outcomes from that development which are not satisfactory. So, as a matter of fact, we've got ourselves some information and contacts, and CARICOM has undertaken to pursue those contacts and to implore all interested parties to take advantage of what is available, build on the support that we've opened up on this week, and it's only an offer. The parties may choose to completely disregard us and go down another road. We have no control over that. But let it not be said that we did not attempt to provide an alternative to the volatility that could result in serious consequences for all of us, mainland and islanders.
Mr. Prime Minister, you did say that Mexico, Uruguay, and CARICOM would be working together to see this through, well, at least on this peace initiative, if I may. Could you tell me what is planned, how soon?
It's a little too early to tell you that. But the Uruguayans have put that out, and that has to do with us standing on the principles of non-intervention. and providing an alternative route. The Uruguayans are just as concerned and did not take part in the vote for or vote against, and so did Mexico. So one has to look at who is accepted as an honest broker or who is willing to work alongside those who are willing to work this out in a different way.
Asking what's next, you know, because even though, Mr. Prime Minister, with all due respect, you came back and said that this mission was a success, we're still seeing those threats flying from all quarters.
Well, considering that you could have seen bullets. But the bottom line is, this thing is changing by the hour, right? So we can't say that we have finished this or we have finished that. And you have to respond to what is happening. So I don't know what tomorrow morning's news is going to be, right? They may decide that we don't want to talk to anybody. The time for talk is over. The previous attempt to have dialogue has failed. And those were some of the conversations that some people had. Our role is to try and say, no, we don't agree that that is so. And that is where we go, hoping that our position prevail through calmer heads. And the one thing we don't want is to end up in a situation where there is conflict and its resulting consequences for our region. So as long as the conflict does not erupt, we think we're making progress. Because the ultimatums and the deadlines were a guaranteed pathway to conflict. Is that clear?
And you truly believe that we have prevented or at least delayed that for now, that mission has done that?
We believe that we've seen movement in some quarters in that way. As a matter of fact, I mean, if you take some time to look at where we were, with some people's position, you would see that those positions, and we've happened to have had a little more insight in the last 2 days. But again, that could change. Impatience can replace all the work that we have done, which is why we keep saying we must remain in a position to talk the problems out for as long as it takes. Meaningful dialogue is CARICOM's position. And we're saying that to the Venezuelans. Your political situation at home now threatens the region. It has invited external forces into the region. You need to get your act together at home. There needs to be meaningful discussion. And there needs to be negotiations towards a solution that could last. That's CARICOM's position.
I don't know if you can divulge any information, but as chairman of the National Security Council, are we on alert, or is our military prepared and ready for any eventuality?
Our military will always be ready to protect Trinidad and Tobago's territory, but I don't know that we're involved in any conflict with anybody. And I should also tell you, I am not only chairman of the National Security Council of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago holds a position in the quasi-cabinet of CARICOM of regional security. So we have a leading role there in seeing this, because this is really a security challenge for the CARICOM. Thank you very much.